those people in there. We were screaming. Everybody that was in it, we were screaming, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. We made it up, but all those people in there, we was, oh God, we was crying. All those people in there. You know, it shook us up so bad. It shook us up.
What about your friends and the people that you know that work in the building? Were they all able to get out, Amy?
Well, the people in my department, I think everyone made it out safe, but I don't know about the rest of them. I mean, you know, I'm worried about them because I don't know if they made it out safe or oh God, or if they died or what. I don't even know.
Where are you now, Amy?
I'm home, but it's like I'm in my bed because my whole body is just shaking. My whole body is shaking. It's like I can't even move. It's just shaking.
Well, Amy, we're awfully glad that you're okay, and we thank you for sharing this terrifying story with us today. And
okay,
we hope that your friends
so
are going to all be okay.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Okay. That's a very vivid account of what so many people went through, and as she indicated, there were so many people left in the building when it came down. Bob Bazell telling us the chilling story of a nurse online with her husband who was still in the building, and then the building came down. There were people in wheelchairs. CNBC's Ron Insana was down in the area when the building came down itself, and even those who were in the immediate surrounding area were in great peril, Ron.
Absolutely, Tom. The billowing smoke that rushed through the streets of Manhattan really enveloped several of us who were trying to get around the World Trade Center and go down to the west side to hook up with NBC and CNBC crews. And it was so enveloping that the air around us turned jet black. You could not see. As I told you earlier in the day, I had the good fortune to find an unlocked car which I was hiding behind, really, to get away from the blowing winds. And as it got darker and darker, I crawled in and stayed there for several minutes until you could see some light again, and then managed to get inside a building as well and connected with a couple of police officers and some others. That video that you look at right now, in some ways does phenomenal justice to what it looked like, but as it's chasing you down the street, there's really no way to describe the feeling that you have trying to get away from the falling debris and the smoke and all the other materials that were flying through the air.
Were you able to breathe during that 2-minute period when it was just pitch black and the air was thick with smoke?
Luckily, the car that I was leaning against and kind of hiding behind was open, and I jumped in as soon as I could. It was very difficult breathing, and it was getting reasonably hot inside the car for lack of air. I don't believe that it was life-threatening, but it sure felt that way. I mean, there was no way to know what was going to happen next. We couldn't tell the trajectory of the building as it began to implode. We didn't know if it would fall on the surrounding buildings or just simply come straight down as it ultimately did. And you didn't know what was next. It was dark. It was impossible to see, hear. There's really no communication with anybody else for 3 or 4 minutes. And inside the building, it was certainly calmer, but again, people were panicked there as well.
All right, thank you very much. CNBC's Ron Insana. In the Middle East today, the Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres was scheduled to meet with Yasser Arafat. Obviously, that meeting was called off. Yasser Arafat has condemned this attack in the United States in the strongest possible terms, and Foreign Minister Shimon Peres joins us now from the NBC Bureau in Tel Aviv. Has your government been in touch with President Bush, Mr. Peres?
No, we were in touch with the American ambassador. We have offered to send our rescue group, which is very trained on it. As a matter of fact, they're already on their way. You know, all of us feel today like being an American. Your pain is our pain, and we can imagine what's going over in the country. But it is the United States, again, that can again save the humanity. One of the greatest dangers to civilization, to our future. It's an attempt to bring us in a jungle where people will not be able to walk or to fly or to feel free. And I think there are ways and means to handle this challenge. And there is nobody better equipped, in spite of all the agonies, than the United States to lead again the world to become a more civilized and safer place.
Mr. Peres, there are going to be so many people who are worried that this act of war, and it is nothing less than this, on the United States will only have a polarizing effect, that it will not be in any way a means to get countries together and right-thinking people in all of the world, including in your very volatile part of the world, to come to some common agreement against terrorism?
I don't think so. I think that the ones among the Arabs who are engaged in terror will today understand that this is the end of the story. They cannot go ahead with it. And I think the world has to get itself organized with the leadership of the United States to identify countries or organizations which are hosting or supporting or financing this terrible form of terror. I think also leaders, religious leaders, spiritual leaders, newspapermen, political figures have to condemn with a full heart the appearance of suicidal murders, which really cause the same damage like in Pearl Harbor. They shouldn't be permitted. It's against the gospel. It's against everything we stand for. And I see it as a world struggle that concerns each of us individually, and I believe we can manage and handle it, no matter if you're an Arab or a Jew or an American.
And what about the conduct of the Israeli government in its continuing conflict with the PLO and with Yasser Arafat? Is that going to be changed as a result of all of this?
That's my hope. We are telling today the Arabs and the Palestinians, look, today it's the chance to depart from terror completely and fully and go back to the district of negotiations, of understanding. Nothing will be solved by weapons and killings, and everything that was solved in the past and may be solved in the future is around the negotiating table.
Have you had any contact with Chairman Arafat today or with his representatives?
What I'm telling you, we let them know as well.
Has there been any rescheduling of the meeting that you were supposed to have today with the chairman?
Not yet, but first of all, let us see what will happen. I hope the Palestinians will use this terrible occasion in order to free from themselves from the mistake of being engaged in acts of terror and destruction.
Shimon Peres, the foreign minister of Israel, a man who's been prominent in that country's leadership, regardless of the government, for so many years. Thank you very much for being with us here today.
Thank you.
Foreign Minister of Israel, who was scheduled to meet today with Yasser Arafat. To bring you back up to date on a couple of matters, President Bush en route from Omaha, Nebraska, Offutt Air Force Base, which is south of Omaha, the Strategic Air Command headquarters, after a National Security Council meeting via teleconferencing. He's now en route back to Washington, D.C. The president was in Florida this morning for an education and literacy event when Andy Card whispered in his ear that there had been a second attack on the World Trade Center. He issued a strong statement, then left there, flew to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, from there to Offutt. Let's listen for just a moment to what the president had to say today.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with...
That's President George W. Bush, who was speaking at that time from Louisiana. Then he went on to Omaha, and he's now on his way back to Washington, D.C. His counselor, Karen Hughes, speaking from the FBI, said that all of the federal agencies had their ongoing operations plans in effect, and the government was performing as best could be expected under the circumstances. Banks did stay open today, even though the financial markets were shut down here in New York City. The minister of the
from our leaders, and we're all very
quoted as saying hundreds of people coming in have been burned from head to toe. Bellevue Hospital reporting more than 100 patients brought in, 2 dead. Beth Israel reporting earlier that 70 patients had been brought in. There are some estimates from hospitals in Virginia near the Pentagon of dozens of people having been brought in there. And I guess the heartening note in all this, hospitals around New York that are not in the immediate vicinity of the World Trade Centers, people saying hundreds of donors are reportedly lined up to give blood outside Beth Israel Medical Center and some others here in New York City. And what I guess is a precursor of what is going to be the kinds of terrible news that we're going to get over the next few days, a spokesman at the medical examiner's office in New York City, the coroner's office, says that for now all of the bodies that are being brought in, dead bodies, will go to the medical examiner's office on First Avenue here in New York. They say they have room for several hundred bodies, and they are making room for more space since they anticipate more bodies will be brought in. One other note to mention, at 4:30 this afternoon Eastern Time, the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, says that it has activated all 10 of FEMA's regional headquarters around the country.
Child psychology at UT Southwestern, Dr. Pete Stefanoa, thank you for joining us.
Sure.
What do you tell your children? Because
I think we have to turn to all the religious leaders to denounce suicidal terrorists. Look the damage they brought. And then our heart is with the United States. Each of us feels today like being an American. Our heart are with the families, with the wounded people. But in spite of it, may I say, America paid a very high price, but America remained the only country that can save the world from this terrible jungle-like introduction.
Sir, it was reported. Sir, it was reported earlier today that the Israeli government believed that this was the work of Osama bin Laden. Is that true?
No, we don't have definite information, and we are not going to blame or to guess.
The Palestinian representative for the PLO here in the United States has said that there is absolutely no clue, there's no indication that any Palestinians were involved in this attack. Do you agree with him? Do you believe him?
I think it's a day for the Palestinians to take the opportunity and divorce terror from their own midst. It will help them. Let them go back. Let us come back to the table of negotiations. With terror, nothing will be achieved, because it doesn't matter who is just responsible for this case. Everybody who is engaged in terror.
Workers calmly, if that's the right word, calmly left the scene, moved out of the area. No reports of trouble at all as firefighters and police personnel came down into the city. Scores, hundreds of civilians started to move out, and they are still calmly moving out. We suspect there is some sense of shock as they try and figure out what has happened to their city, what has happened to their lives, and perhaps most importantly, what has happened to their friends and their co-workers who may not have gotten out of those buildings today. One of the problems that the city is faced with is, and as Richard alluded to, is moving people around. You have essentially a shutdown going on here. In some of the outlying areas, city governments are trying to support the city as best they can. Tom Swayze is the mayor of Glen Cove out on Long Island. Tom, I think you're on the phone. Mr. Mayor, can you hear me?
Yes, this is Tom Swayze, mayor of the city of Glen Cove.
Tom, tell us what Glen Cove is doing to support the efforts going on here in Manhattan.
We have high-speed ferries that operate from Glen Cove to Pier 11 down by Wall Street. And we've already evacuated about 1,200 people with the help of Fox Navigation from New York City out here back to the island. We are now working at the request of Commissioner Carrick to try and bring emergency personnel, doctors, nurses, back into Manhattan to try and help relieve some of these doctors and nurses that are going to start getting very exhausted at the area hospitals down on the southern tip of Manhattan.
And is there a number people should call or a location they ought to go to if they are medical personnel and can help in the effort down there, where they can get on one of these ferries and come on down?
We'd like them to come to the end of Glen Cove Road, the northern end of Glen Cove Road in Glen Cove, to the parking lot across from our police station, the end of Glen Cove Road, across from the Glen Cove Police Station, where we will take them by bus down to the ferry terminal. If they want to call for information, they should call the ferry terminal itself at 609-3342, 609-3342. We're coordinating with the Nassau County and Suffolk County emergency management offices as well, but right now we need to get emergency-type personnel, doctors, nurses, EMTs. We know everybody wants to help, but we're not looking for just regular volunteers who mean well, and we appreciate their interest. We're looking for professionals who can go into Manhattan and be prepared to work.
Tom, thank you for joining us and for your efforts today. I apologize for mispronouncing your name a moment ago. Thank you. Judy in Washington.
Aaron, we're here in the Washington studio, and among others, I'm joined by former U.S. Secretary of State Alexander Haig, former Army General Haig. You were, of course, Secretary of State during the Ronald Reagan administration. And, Mr. Secretary, you were in that post at a time of a national emergency, the assassination attempt on the life of President Reagan. And what I want to specifically ask you about is, what is it like for the people on the inside, the heartbeat of government, when something horrific like this happens? Of course, this is a very different situation, but what is it like when you have to react to something?
Well, I think most people wait and look for direction, and so it's very important that they have it. If they don't, they sometimes sit in shocked inaction, and so you have to have that, and that's the critical aspect of moving through a crisis of this kind.
And we've heard
attendance this moment, but as it has been about 8 hours now, let us try to bring you up to date with the horrendous sights and sounds of this attack on the United States and its citizens today. Here's ABC's John Donvan.
We want to tell you what we know as we know it. We just got a report in that there's been some sort of explosion at
the first thing any television camera saw this morning was this. Just before 9 o'clock, roughly 15 minutes earlier, an American Airlines jet hijacked from Boston had crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. There were 92 people on board.
It does not appear that there's any kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
My God.
That looks like a second plane.
I did not see a plane go in.
Minutes later, the second plane, the second tower. The fireball ate up the aircraft. It was a United Airlines flight, a 767 from Boston to Los Angeles. There had been 65 people on board.
Some sort of a concerted.
I was happened to look on the first tower, and I actually saw people waving where the first plane crashed through, and then it was unbelievable seeing this second jet come crashing into the second tower. What is going on?
New York City was staggered.
As soon as he got hit, I was thrown to a window. So I was very lucky to get out. There's a lot of people that didn't get out. There's a lot of people coming down the stairs, burnt up. It's bad.
And still it wasn't over. This was the southern tower falling in on itself. It was now roughly an hour since the first attack. Meanwhile, it was beginning here in Washington. Another hijacked plane hits the Pentagon.
U.S. officials are saying there was no warning, no indicators of any kind of a likely terrorist attack. Number two, they say Pentagon officials within the intelligence and the counterterrorism offices are now looking at this very intensely.
ABC reporters across the city are beginning to hear the word terrorism.
It seems obvious unofficially to people here that it was a terrorist attack, but they obviously can't reach any firm conclusions at this point. So the Pentagon is engaged, and I'm sure law enforcement is, but they say they had no warnings.
Report piles on report.
Okay, there's been an explosion of some kind that shook the ground of the Capitol. We all heard it. Everybody ran for cover. We don't know where it was. We don't see the smoke yet. Everybody's saying, get back. We're running, we're running, we're running, we're running. They're screaming at us to get back.
On television, it looked like it was happening all over. 10:28 a.m., New York City, and in the shadow of the one remaining tower, a snatch of conversation between a reporter and a rescuer.
Why are they pulling us out of here?
Because the tower is leaning.
The north tower is leaning. Right, Marty, quick. Oh my God, there it goes!
I looked up as soon as we got across the street. I looked up, I saw the tower start to buckle. I just turned and ran, ducked down, put a jacket over my head. 3 or 4 of us huddled together, and it was just black everywhere.
Washington, the White House is evacuated.
The Office of Personnel Management says all federal office buildings in the Washington area have been evacuated and closed. The employees sent home immediately.
The evacuation order creates instant gridlock in downtown Washington. The president was not in the city. He was in Florida visiting a school.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
Officials at this end are not confirming that the president's plane is going to Andrews. We don't know if it's going to Andrews or some other location. All they've said is that he will convene a National Security Council meeting, and we don't know where that will take place either. Obviously, they want to keep a lot of people guessing as to the president's whereabouts.
Now it was lunchtime, and yet more terrible news is coming in. Another United airliner with 45 people on board has crashed south of Pittsburgh, presumably another victim of terrorism.
We talked to a couple of people who actually witnessed the plane going down and said it was quite devastating. Went right down into the woods. They saw all sorts of debris flying out into the woods and into the trees, and it's quite a devastating scene from what we're told.
At this point, it is hard to believe we're still in the same day that began with this picture. National Guard units are out. Washington is shut down. Airports in the U.S. and Canada are closed. And the death toll, still uncountable, is also unimaginable. John Donvan, ABC News, Washington.
Excellent report from John Donvan, pulling together this day, which has so much immediacy, so much history, such magnitude to it, and touches every American. And as I turn around on occasion to look at the computer screen behind me, I find emails coming in from people in other countries, Canada and Europe included, from friends and from families and colleagues, all expressing this deep empathy and sympathy for people here today who had friends and acquaintances, but just seeming at whatever distance to appreciate what is happening, even though they were not close to it. We're now joined by a young man who was very close to it again. This is Evan Fairbanks. He's a freelance photographer. Interestingly enough, you and I were just talking about journalists' emotions at a time like this, and the last thing journalists can afford to do is to fall prey to their emotions at a time like this, because it's too hard in the middle of the story. But you were very close this morning and photographing on assignment for a church when things began to happen. So we're going to show your videotape, if we may, though. Are you principally a still photographer? Or both?
Still and video.
Okay. Can we just look at what your first video is and explain it to us?
I walked out of Trinity Church after we had a blackout in our studio, and one of the studio managers grabbed one of our cameras when we knew what was happening. And I went out and was shooting aftermath.
Good God.
And I suddenly saw a plane flying into my viewfinder and said, gee, it's kind of close for that to be here now, and then realized what happened.
Yeah.
And
we'll run this again, because I think this is, when we run that again, Roger Goodman, that's Roger Goodman, our director, because this is We've seen footage before of people on the run, and I understand that that's your shadow as you went by a storefront.
Yeah, actually, it was. It's the first time I've seen that.
And was there absolute panic immediately?
Instantly. It was just pandemonium. Nobody knew what to do. There was no clear thinking. People were just reacting to kind of save themselves and the people around them.
You're in the same location when the building comes down.
I had been taken downstairs by Port Authority police who knew that I had this videotape. And we were moving actually to go back to the Trinity Church to make them a dub of the tape in a format that they could use on a VHS tape. And suddenly I heard one of the guys say, "Hey, Evan, watch out."
Hang on just a second. If you look in the upper, this now is frozen. And this is an angle of this attack that we have not seen before. At the top of the building on your left, out of the left, will come the building. And watch how the aircraft penetrates the building. Go ahead. Completely in one side and out the other.
It just disappeared. It disappeared like a bad special effect. It disappeared right into the building. I've seen it 6, 7 times now. It's still incomprehensible what is actually happening there. You're right. As a journalist, you have to take yourself away from it, and I'm still not there yet. And the more and more I see it, and as time goes by.
The modern technology enables us to see horror just as we are able to see sport in a variety of different speeds or at a variety of different speeds. And I think you now have a better appreciation than we have had up until now, for which we thank you, Evan, because we see exactly how determined somebody was to do this horrible damage, taking a plane so powerfully and so fast in one side of the building other. Tell me more what it's been like for you today as working the street.
It's numbing. It's like being in the 4th dimension. It's like we're not even it's not even New York City where it's happening. Nothing is normal. People are just walking in a daze up and down the streets. Nobody knows where to go. I just feel kind of this nervous, anxious buzz, and still unfathomable.
Trinity Church, one of the oldest, I think the oldest Episcopal church, certainly in this part of the world, certainly the oldest in the city, on the edge of Wall Street there. Was it being used? Did people come to it for any subsequent occasion?
It was we were only shooting a kind of a teleconference up in the 4th floor TV studio there. And we were all sitting in the studio about an hour before our airtime, and there was the lights went out for a second, they flickered. And we kind of joked with the studio guys that they had just put in a new studio and said, "Hey, you guys better watch out for that. That's not normal." And then within 10 seconds, people came running in and said that the Trade Center had been hit, they tried to call a production meeting and ask people to stay in the building, and people were just kind of fleeing. And I grabbed my still camera and was going to run out, not really heeding what anybody was saying there, knowing what was happening outside and feeling the need to be there. And one of the guys came out of the studio with a camera and was putting a tape in it, and I just grabbed it and ran.
And we saw the shadow of you running across the street. What was you were afraid of, principally, as you were running?
I was afraid that I was going to be rained upon by whatever was coming off the building. So I knew that I had a few seconds to get basically an establishing shot, and then I had to look out for myself. And I ran. I was on the southeast corner of the plaza. I'm not sure exactly what building is there. And I just went around the corner a little south on Church and just got underneath the car and pointed the camera up into the sky and stayed there for a while, and then came out after a few minutes when the debris stopped raining so heavily. And I went around the corner and was pulled under an overhang by a couple of Port Authority police, to whom I immediately mentioned what I had shot. And they just grabbed me and whisked me down into the Port Authority Police headquarters, and we were leaving there to go back to Trinity Church to make a dub of the tape, when suddenly the tower to the top collapsed. And I just looked up and saw from basically 2 blocks away this reverse mushroom cloud coming down at me.
I said earlier, it looks like a banana suddenly being peeled. It's extraordinary.
I've seen shots of the collapse from far away, and I just can't believe that I was actually there and walked away. I mean, I had to dive underneath. I ran backwards with the camera just pointed behind me, away from the scene, and saw that, you know, have heard about clouds enveloping people and oxygen being depleted, and I just dove under the biggest emergency response vehicle that I could see, stayed there for about 30 seconds, saw nothing but pitch black. I started having difficulty breathing. I thought my oxygen was starting to dwindle, and there was a moment when I said, well, this might be it. And my only chance is to get out and start walking north.
Well, we're very grateful to you. Very grateful you're okay, and that you took these photographs and that you shared them with the public. They're very dramatic. I needn't tell you that, but I'm very grateful to you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Nice to see you. Evan Fairbank. He's a freelance photographer who was working in Trinity Church today on the edge of Wall Street today when he and his colleagues on a production shoot in a church saw these two extraordinary scenes from, to put it directly, from a different angle, because we have seen it so many times, but this is the most dramatic angle we have seen this plane flying at the top of that building. It's quite extraordinary. I want to go to Washington very briefly because we said the president was on his way, we believe, to Washington from Nebraska, and ABC's Claire Shipman is there, and I gather, Claire, the president wants to talk to the nation again.
Indeed, he does. He is on his way back to Washington at this point. We're told he does plan to address the nation tonight, but we don't have a time for that. We're told that he feels very strongly about this. People said the FBI is the main person.
Yeah. Clear if the plane was.
And he's mine, and I'm not going to let some crazy person take.
And Aaron, this may be another point where we want to say, God bless the souls of those who have lost their lives today or who are dying.
How much direct proof we have of the involvement of the countries. If we have direct
and running, and that's what's most important to us, so try to minimize the risks. So it looks like a lot of people will be back. A couple of little notes about the president's return. We're told it's likely he will land, as he usually does, at Andrews Air Force Base. They think the airspace here is probably United States. We've known the president's been flying around the country. The vice president's been out of sight. The Secretary of Defense, Mr. Rumsfeld, has also been out of sight. What can you tell us about him, and what else is going on there?
A short time ago, he did come out and inspect the damage here at the Pentagon, along with the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Richard Myers. We're so far away, though, we could barely see that it was them. It had to be pointed out to me by a Pentagon official who they were. The Secretary of Defense, although initially ran to the scene, apparently, of the tragedy and actually assisted getting some people onto stretchers, was then brought back to the National Military Command Center in the bowels of the Pentagon, a secure war room area where he has been receiving intelligence briefings and informational updates. The Pentagon says that it can account for all of the senior military leadership. None of them were killed in this attack. However, there have been some
Jamie McIntyre, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're going to go to Israel. The Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon.
Terror attacks, the worst that had ever been seen. We express our deep regret and send our condolences, wholehearted condolences. We are ready to extend whatever aid and assistance is required. War against terror is an international war, a war of a coalition of the free world against all the terror groups and against whoever believes that can pose a threat to freedom. This is a war between the good and the bad, between humanity and those who are bloodthirsty. The criminal attack today on innocent civilians in the United States is a turning point in war against international terror. Even if the war against terror is long, and even if the terror will try to raise its head again, there won't be any room in the world in which terrorists, their assistants, and those who send them to be able to find a shelter or a refuge. the government of Israel has decided tomorrow a mourning day in a show of solidarity with the American people. I would like to send my condolences to the American people, to President George Bush, and to all the citizens of the United States. In this very difficult hour, our hearts are with you. Could you tell the Israeli public what are the impacts of these attacks on the people here? I have already said very clearly that there will only be a statement. There won't be any other statement apart from what I have already said. We have to wait and see what happened. Our stand vis-à-vis terror is very well known, very firm and decisive, and we will act accordingly.
On behalf בהמשך להחלטת המטבחון שבעת הזאת עליהם להפסיק באופן מיידי את הטרור במצב הנוכחי ושיטב להם אם יעשו זאת מבחינתם באופן חד צדדי לרשות הפלסטינית. זה המסר ששמעון פרס העביר. עד כאן יעקב.
Against our common values. The fight against terror is an international struggle of the free world against the forces of darkness who seek to destroy our liberty and our way of life. I believe that together we can defeat these forces of evil. At this most difficult hour, all Israelis stand as one with the American people. Our hearts are with you, and we are ready to provide any assistance at any time. The government of Israel has declared a day of mourning tomorrow as we bow our heads and share in the sorrow of the American people. טוב, תודה רבה לכם.
Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon talking briefly with reporters, offering first of all his condolences to Americans, saying whoever believes or saying rather this has been a threat to freedom. He went on to say this is a criminal attack on innocent civilians, and he called it a turning point in the war against international terrorism. He went on to say, he said, even if this war is long, there will be no room for terrorists to find refuge. He also said that tomorrow in Israel will be a day of mourning. Now we want to go back to the Pentagon, to CNN's military affairs correspondent, Jamie McIntyre. You want to pick up where you left off, Jamie, describing the situation there and also what Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld is up to.
Well, Judy, the fires are still burning here in some parts of the Pentagon, as you can see from some of the smoke that's coming up from behind me. There will be a recovery effort that will get underway fairly soon. A lot of heavy equipment has brought in so-called urban rescue units that are usually used in the event of an earthquake, have been brought in from some of the local fire departments in Fairfax and Montgomery County in order to assist in trying to find the bodies of people here. They have not given any casualty figures, but we know that people died in this incident, including, I mean, not the least of which is the more than 60 passengers who were on that American Airlines Flight 77 that took off from Dulles Airport this morning. One of the eyewitnesses to this incident was a TV reporter himself who was in traffic and actually saw the plane come in. I talked to him earlier today. His name is Mike Walter of USA Today Live.
I was heading in northbound on 27, and the traffic this morning, it was, a typical rush hour, had ground to a standstill, and I looked off, looked out my window, I saw this plane, a jet, American Airlines jet coming, and I thought, this doesn't add up, it's really low, and I saw it just went, it was like a cruise missile with wings, went right there and slammed right into the Pentagon. Huge explosion, great ball of fire, and smoke started billowing out, and then it was just chaos on the highway as people either tried to move around the traffic and go down either forward or backwards. We had a lady who was in front of me who was backing up and screaming, "Everybody go back, they've hit the Pentagon." And, it's just sheer terror.
What goes through your mind when you see something like that?
I've asked that question of a million people, and the only thing that I just kept uttering it over and over again. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. I can't believe this. And I think that's what goes through your mind, is that you just can't believe that something like this could happen. And yet I was sitting there listening on the radio to the accounts of what had happened in New York. I just listened to the president, and you'd think, as a journalist, I'd put two and two together and think, oh my God, but it didn't even occur to me.
And obviously this was an enormous tragedy, but did you witness any of the rescue or any of the victims?
I got to tell you, I got out and walked over, and I saw parts of the plane. The debris was actually on the overpass there, and I watched as this military personnel just came running out with stretchers and tarps and set up a triage unit. And I just couldn't help but feel for these guys. Those are their friends and comrades in there, and yet they immediately jumped into action. It was unbelievable to watch. And the toughest thing for me right now is I've got a 14-year-old daughter, and a lot of her friends have parents who work in the Pentagon. And I just talked to her on the phone, and those kids are going through agony tonight. They don't know if they're okay. So it's tough. This really hits home.
And Judy, there's still a lot of work to be done here. This part of the Pentagon had undergone a major renovation. Some of the people here told me stories about heroic efforts. Others described how some of the new architecture of the renovated Pentagon may have helped save their lives. One Navy officer told me about how he saw the flames rush by his window, which shook, but because they're made of new tempered glass that had been put in to increase security, they did not break. The work will continue throughout the night. Pentagon officials say they do hope to reoccupy the other part of the building that's not affected. It's a huge building. 24,000 people work here, but it may be a number of days before anybody's able to go back to work. Judy?
All right, Jamie McIntyre reporting from the Pentagon. And Jamie, your interview reminding us that first and foremost, this is a horrific human tragedy. Families with hearts broken in New York, in Washington, and all across this nation. Just a quick word on what we've been learning. We do expect tonight President George Bush will speak to the nation in a televised address. We don't have much more information than that in terms of when. In addition, we are told that the 4 leaders of Congress, the House Speaker Dennis Hastert, the House Democratic leader Richard Gephardt, over in the Senate side, Tom Daschle, the Democratic leader, and Trent Lott, the Republican leader, all 4 of them will come together at, I'm told, 7:30 on the east front of the Capitol for a news statement, perhaps a news conference. We all know that at times of crisis, the very visceral fights that go on between the political parties in our country fall away. It may only be for a brief period, but this is one of those times when political partisan differences are being put aside to come together to speak to the country. Joining me here in the Washington studio, a familiar name, a familiar face, best-selling author of so many novels, Tom Clancy, mysteries at the heart, Tom Clancy, of the military community, the intelligence community. People in our newsroom have been saying today what's happening is like right out of a Tom Clancy novel, but could you possibly imagine something like this to write about?
No, one of the problems with being a writer of fiction is that you can't keep up with all the madmen in the world as much as you try. And I frankly would have thought that this was not a credible threat to have 4 separate people decide to commit suicide in the same way on the same morning.
Why not?
Because ending your own life is not something the average person does. You know, everybody's assuming these are Islamic terrorists. Well, if so, they've defiled their own religion. You know, Islam does not permit suicide. It says you go to hell if you do something like this.
But we see suicide bombings in the Middle East and in Israel. And
Judy, we saw people in Northern Ireland, Catholics acting like savages and Protestants acting like savages. So anyhow, we have people who call themselves Muslims acting like savages. It happens. It's not because of their religion, it's because they're fools.
What does this say now? I mean, you've done a lot of reporting. I mean, you not only write fiction, you do a lot of reporting from inside the intelligence community, inside the military community. What does this say about how prepared we are as a country?
Well, people always ask that kind of a question when things go wrong, but you don't ask the question when things go right, and the reason is you can't tell when things go right in that business. Well, one of the things I've been saying for a lot of years is that we need to upgrade the human capability, human intelligence capabilities in CIA and the rest of our intelligence community, because you can do a lot with satellites, you can do a lot with eavesdropping techniques, but you can't find out what's in a person's mind except by talking to that person. And so the agency needs to increase its human intelligence capability. The CIA has about 20,000 employees, less than 1,000 of whom are actually field intelligence officers. That number should be at least doubled. But yeah, America as a nation doesn't love our intelligence community. And certainly the news media does not love our intelligence community.
I'm going to interrupt you, Tom Clancy. I'm told Aaron Brown in New York has a development. Aaron?
Well, Judy, just in the last few seconds, another building, we will speculate carefully here that there was building number 7, one of the buildings in support of the World Trade Center towers has collapsed. Those of you who have been with us for a while, you can see indeed that the smoke color has changed has gotten much lighter. So we believe that yet another building, this would be the 3rd building, has collapsed, likely building number 7. Although we also heard that there were problems at building number 5, and it's possible that one went down too. But again, another building in the Trade Center complex appears now to have caved in after these attacks. Judy?
Aaron, we're looking at these pictures, Tom Clancy and I, as we sit here in the Washington studio, and just as I come back to Tom Clancy, I want to read just a portion of a statement issued by Secretary of State Powell, Colin Powell, calling these attacks a terrible tragedy befallen not just my nation, but all the nations of this region, all the nations of the world, all those who believe in democracy. Tom Clancy, you were saying, sure, we can ask these questions about failed security, failed intelligence when things go wrong, but we have every right to ask these questions, don't we?
Well, the First Amendment, you have a right to say anything you want, but as a practical matter, one of the things we have to do, if you want to prevent things like this from happening, is you build up your defenses. And your first line of defense against terrorism is an intelligence gathering capability. Now, when was the last time CNN or the news media in general said, gee, we ought to put more money into the human intelligence capabilities of the CIA? Answer, you never do it. Never.
Well, we wouldn't take a side on something like that. Anyway, in terms of what do you fund and...
Yeah, we always take a side on saying they failed. Why not help them succeed once in a while?
Are you saying that they are significantly underfunded in that area? And not just the CIA, but the FBI?
Human intelligence is de-emphasized. The FBI's job is...
Spying is what we're talking about
Yeah,
here.
that's what intelligence officers do, is they spy. And the CIA has 20,000 employees, about 800 of whom are actually spooks. And of them, maybe as many as 2/3 actually get outside and do spook operations.
And we know that...
And we need to do better than that. We need to do more than that. You gather information of this type by putting people out on the street, same way cops gather information from informants. This isn't rocket science. It's just a matter of hiring the people and letting them do the work.
But I'm going to turn it back over to Aaron, but my question is, how do you know what to believe? We had an Arab journalist in London just today saying, we had this information a few weeks ago, it was coming, we didn't know whether to believe it. Now back to Aaron in New York.
Thank you. We've talked a number of times today about the fact that it is simply too dangerous for officials to get in and around these buildings. It's so very, very dangerous, and the proof of that, just a few moments ago when another building in the complex that is the World Trade Center, or was the World Trade Center, collapsed. Maureen, we can show you what that looked like. These are taped pictures taken literally just a few moments ago. When that building went down, we are seeing them for the first time. This is, correct me in the booth, but I believe that was, in fact, a piece of tape that we got just a bit ago of the second plane hitting the South Tower of the Trade Center. just a little bit after 9 o'clock this morning. Again, a third building at the Trade Center has collapsed within the last 3 or 4 minutes. Building number 7, this is no small building, as you can see, at 47 stories. It would stand out in most American cities. It looks small, I guess, when you look at what was the 100+ stories of the World Trade Center, but building number 7, it's 40+ stories, almost 50 stories, collapsing as well. And if we can go back to the tape and see it one more time, and I'll look at it with you. Again, this occurred just in the last several moments around the Trade Center building. Building number 7, 47 stories. Maureen Madden, CNN producer, is in the area. Maureen, what can you tell us? What did you see?
Well, about 2 minutes ago, we happened to see 7 World Trade Center go down, which holds the Office of Emergency Management for the City of New York on the 23rd floor there. When we heard from the fire department of NYPD, is that the whole south part of the building was engulfed in flames at one point, and it was a matter of time to collapse. They're just waiting for it to collapse, which we've been waiting for about a half hour. When it went down, it was quick, it was quiet, and we saw a lot of smoke come up. And now the smoke has pretty much gone off to the side, going towards the east side of Manhattan.
So unlike the collapse of the first of the towers way back this morning, around 10 or so this morning, and then the second tower, which collapsed shortly thereafter, at least where building number 7 is concerned, a building that, among other things, housed the emergency response team of the City of New York, at least they had some warning. They had signs that this might happen, and they were able to get as many people away from the area. And the people in the area, of course, are firefighters, EMS personnel, and literally thousands of police officers who have cordoned off the area.
Correct. About 5 minutes ago.
For those of you who have been with us throughout the day, we have shown you a number of times a piece of video, pictures of a plane coming into the building. We have now another piece of video that will show the same thing, different angle. And if we can roll that and take a look now, this again was shortly after the first. Wow, oh my gosh. I wonder, this comes to us from PAX TV. I wonder, guys, if we can re-cue that in a moment and show that again. You see the fire coming out of the first building there, the plane on the lower left side of your screen. And it looks to me, and I'll confess I don't have the greatest monitor here, that you could almost see the nose of that plane coming through the other side of the building. That may have been an illusion as we looked at it here, but that's how it looked to us. As the flames, these are fully loaded planes, fully loaded with jet fuel. They were headed from the East Coast to the West Coast, so they had an enormous amount of jet fuel. Jeffrey Beatty, a security consultant, said to us a little bit ago, this was low-tech, high-concept. The plane was the bomb, and you just saw the bomb go off. That was around 10 o'clock this morning. That was around 9 o'clock this morning, about 9:08 this morning. Ben Wiedemann, who normally reports for us, I'm sorry, we'll get to that. Let's go back to Washington and CNN's Judy Woodruff. Judy?
Aaron, again, pictures that have everyone here riveted. We're told, I don't know whether we have this picture right now available to show our viewers, but I'm told that just a short time ago, driving up Massachusetts Avenue, which is one of the main thoroughfares here in the nation's capital, goes all the way from the Capitol out to Northwest Washington, beyond the Naval Observatory where the Vice President lives, and beyond on out into the Maryland suburbs. There was observed a convoy of military vehicles, Humvees, military vehicles, driving up slowly, appearing to patrol the area, going out away from the Capitol toward northwest, toward Maryland. Now, perhaps this is just a patrolling effort, but the sight of it has to be something to cause comment, because normally at this hour in Washington you would see an enormous amount of just rush hour traffic, but today is not like any other day. Now to our own senior White House correspondent, John King, who's just about a block and a half from the White House on top of an office building up above the 10th floor there. John?
Judy, a few quick bits of information. As we have been reporting, the president is on his way back to Washington, and we can now say definitively that when he arrives in Washington, he will address the American people tonight. I am told by sources plans are for an address from the White House. The target time, 9 p.m. That could be moved up a little, but 8 or 9 p.m. we are now told is the target time. But for now, the administration will not confirm that the address will be broadcast from the White House. There have been security concerns throughout the day. We see now on the grounds of the White House, which was evacuated hours ago, some bomb-sniffing dogs and other security personnel securing the area around the White House. But we are told by administration officials the president will be back in Washington shortly and will address the American people tonight. And as we reported a bit earlier, congressional leaders who also, as part of the protocol, the emergency evacuation protocol, were taken to secure locations themselves outside of Washington. The bipartisan congressional leadership also making its way back to Washington, and it will deliver statements, the 4 leaders from the steps of the Capitol tonight as well. All of these designed to offer signs of reassurances to the American people that their government is up and running at this time of great tragedy. I want to add one other bit of information. A lot of lawmakers trying to get briefings from Capitol Hill police, from administration officials, from the CIA and the FBI and others. We are told that in those briefings there has been some speculation, and again the law enforcement officials saying this is just speculation at this moment, that that plane that crashed outside of Pittsburgh may have been heading toward Washington. In those briefings, I'm told by several sources, 3 potential targets were listed. 1, the presidential retreat at Camp David, 2, the White House, and 3, the United States Capitol building. Again, though, lawmakers and other officials being given those briefings told that is speculative, but based on the flight paths and everything else we've seen unfold on this tragic day, that law enforcement officials believe at this moment that the potential targets for that plane, which crashed outside Pittsburgh, were perhaps Camp David, perhaps the White House behind me, or perhaps the United States Capitol. Judy?
John, and we can only imagine the struggle that must have gone on board that aircraft in the cockpit or wherever in order to keep the plane from going where the people who wanted to bring it to Washington, they were obviously prevented from reaching their target. Air travel throughout the United States, domestic air travel, has been shut down today since these terrible incidents in New York City and here in Washington. In fact, there's no air travel until at least noon tomorrow on order of the Federal Aviation Administration. But right now we want to go to one of the airports in the Washington area, that is Dulles International. This is the site of where the American Airlines flight 77 that left this morning on its way to Los Angeles and ended up plowing into the Pentagon a very short time later. CNN's Eileen O'Connor is there at Dulles. Eileen?
Well, there has been some activity here, Judy. The FBI has arrived, and they have been seen going in and out of the building. They brought some equipment in to check through the building. We do know from airport personnel and the airport authority that both National and Dulles are shut down till 11 o'clock at least tomorrow morning, but also that they immediately implemented an emergency drill procedure. And that means that they called in all of their police, and they have their own police force and their own fire personnel, and they also have all of their operational staff here at the airport. They are securing the airport. You can see actually behind me, they have actually erected barricades, concrete barricades, with some of these forklifts. Have been operating over the last hour, erecting these barricades. Also, there's barricades right now in the entrances to the airport to prevent anyone from coming back here. As you also said, United and American Airlines, obviously they are the ones that lost flights. They have been issuing statements saying that they are trying to help the families, both of these airlines issuing statements. They've also said that they have accounted for all of their other flights and that they are all safely on the ground. They want to make sure people know that. And they also say that they will do everything they can to make sure that their customers, the people who were traveling, are comfortable until they can fly on to their destinations. Judy?
And Eileen, any other people around there? I mean, we see you, obviously, and we see a few other people, but presumably not much other activity there at all.
No, and they have actually tried to stage some of the, obviously there are relatives, concerned relatives from the American flight that took off from this morning, and we are being told by airport authorities that they are trying to send those relatives over to a nearby hotel and to try to give them information. Both airlines have issued phone numbers for for people to find out about loved ones. One of those airlines is United. Their number is 800-932-8555. But they are saying that people should stay away from the airports. These airports are shut. Again, they're under emergency procedures. And also, you know, Judy, for here, an investigation is taking place. The FBI is already here. They've had sniffer dogs around the airport. They want to see how the security was breached. We are also told that the tarmac has been secure, that the airplanes that are currently on the ground were very quickly secured after it was decided to shut these airports down. Judy?
Eileen, just reiterating, there were 8 cities in the United States involved with these aircraft that plowed into the Trade Center building complex, into the Pentagon, and then into the ground in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, south of Pittsburgh. 2 planes took off from Boston, 1 from Newark, 1 from Dulles near Washington, where you are. 3 of those flights were headed for Los Angeles, 1 for San Francisco. Of course, none of those flights reached their intended destination. Now back to Aaron in New York.
Judy, thank you. It is, I know for many of you around the country, you are making your way home. You have not necessarily been with us all day long. Life has gone on, I suppose, with TVs on in most offices, but life has gone on. I just wonder if we can take a shot of the building behind me, the World Trade Center building, and just take a moment to try and absorb, not with the facts, not with the pieces of information, but just look at that scene and think about what happened today. There were 50,000 or so people who came to work on a beautiful late summer morning here in New York, in those 2 towers that are now gone. These are people with families, with children, people who had offices and have them no more, people whose lives are forever changed. And it happened in a space of very few minutes. 8:48 this morning it began. A few minutes later, at about 9:08, a second plane zoomed towards the unhit tower, the second tower. You see it in the lower part of your screen. And it just slices that tower in half. If we can re-rack it and show it again so you'll know where to look, you'll see the plane first in the lower left side of the screen coming at it, and there it goes. And what must it have been like in those buildings and on these hijacked airliners? We heard earlier that Barbara Olson, a frequent commentator here, was on the flight that was going to Washington, or had been hijacked to Washington. She called her husband and said that the hijacking was underway. She said that from what she could tell, the hijackers, and she didn't indicate how many, except there was more than one, were armed with just knives and cardboard cutters, that they had herded all the people on board this flight to the back of the plane, including the pilot. And she asked her husband, the Solicitor General, Ted Olson, who many of you will recall argued the post-election case before the Supreme Court, said to her husband, "What do I do?" And shortly after that, that plane with Ms. Olson and many more crashed at the Pentagon. General Wesley Clark joins us from Little Rock. General Clark has been with us a number of times today. General, I wonder if you will weigh in for a second on this debate or this discussion that has been going on for most of the afternoon here, which is, have we misapplied in some ways, intelligence resources, that we have become so infatuated with what we can do with machines and high tech that we have inappropriately, I guess, spent less money, less time, less effort on the down and dirty human intelligence.
Well, that's certainly a question that everyone is going to be asking, and it will be asked in official channels, and it will be asked to those who are best in a position to give that answer. My experience with it has been that I've heard this charge now for some 25 years in the intelligence business, and we have put emphasis into not only technical intelligence but human intelligence. But you know, it's very hard to get the kind of specific intelligence that would prevent something like this. Many of these people are members of a family. They come from a specific village, perhaps. Their background is known and vetted. They're carefully controlled. Their movements and communications are monitored. And it's difficult, no doubt, for any intelligence organization, no matter how well it's resourced and how courageous its members, to penetrate an organization like that and give us information. Intelligence is always characterized by a failure to know what you don't know. And I'm sure that we'll make improvements. There are always more things that could be done in the aftermath of something like this. But if there's one single message that comes through to me here, and I think will come through to many others, it's that it's not enough simply to put up the best defenses against terrorism, but that more active measures are no doubt called for, particularly in this case.
When you say more active measures, you're talking about proactive?
That's right. Preemptive measures. We've known a number of these groups have, for a long time, said they declared war on the United States. And we have dealt with them, we've fenced with them, we've cooperated with other governments against them, we've chased individuals, we've hauled some into court. But I think that not only do we have to ask ourselves, could we have learned more in this specific case, we have to also ask ourselves, could we have done more if we've been willing to take greater risks, if we've been willing to take more extraordinary measures earlier, to take some of these groups and these individuals at their word that they had declared war on us and they deserved to be taken seriously and they merited some preemptive action.
And just perhaps stating the obvious, sir, when you talk about preemptive action, first of all, you got to be able to find the people you're taking the action against. Do we know where the right people are so that if the country is going after these people, they get the right people?
Well, I think that's always the problem. And there will always be a certain degree of uncertainty, and there'll be a certain degree of concern about this. The best way to handle any international terrorist organization is to arrest its leaders, present the evidence, and have them tried in a court of law. And that certainly is the way anyone would prefer to deal with this. But perhaps in some cases, it's not possible to do that, or it's not possible to do that quick enough. We'll have to ask those questions in the aftermath. It's not simply about intelligence, it's also about acting on intelligence.
I mean, ultimately, sir, this is not simply a military or an intelligence question. This is a core political question. It really has to do with how we see ourselves in a country, whether we are willing to take the risks that some innocents may perish because of what we as a country do, and that's a political question for the country to deal with.
It's a profound political question, and I think it's also a question for the international community, because an event like this is a real cry for alarm and recognition in the international community. A tragedy like this can happen here, it can happen anywhere, and international terrorism is too dangerous and too ambiguous and too difficult for any single nation to handle by itself. We need strong, reliable support from friends and allies around the world, and I'm sure we'll be asking for it. And clearly one of the things that ought to come from this is not only better U.S. intelligence, it's better sharing of information, pooling of information with our partners in all corners of the globe.
General Clark, thanks again for joining us as you have a number of other times today, and I suspect you will again before the day is out. General Wesley Clark in Little Rock, Arkansas today. Thank you, sir. Judy?
Aaron, we want to tell our viewers, first of all, that we have just been handed a report from CNN reporter Patty Davis that all international flights have now arrived or will be arriving shortly. Those are flights coming into the United States or Canada. Those are flights that presumably had left their destination hours and hours ago, but they have arrived safely, or they are expected to shortly. We'll continue to bring you updates on air travel as we get them. And I've just been told that President Bush will address the nation tonight at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. And we had been told a little bit earlier the President would be speaking to the American people. We now have confirmed the time is 9 o'clock Eastern, and you can count on the fact, of course, CNN will
this explosion throughout the night tonight. The reason the ambulances are still sitting empty at this point is because we understand from rescue workers they have not been able to get close enough to the actual midpoint of the explosion to actually bring anybody out, which is the reason that they are still standing by. They've told us the system here, Peter, I heard you talking about setting up a triage system. The system here will be as follows. Victims who come in and are tagged red are victims that they believe can be saved. Victims who are tagged yellow and green are walking wounded and will be quickly taken away to other locations. And then there are the black tags for those people who they feel they cannot help.
Thanks, Cynthia. We'll come back to you. I want to go quickly to Stoystown, Pennsylvania, the one where ABC's Dan Harris is standing by. 4 aircraft involved today, and we know that on each one of them there was a hijacking in process. And the aircraft that crashed near Johnstown, Pennsylvania, was United Flight 93 with 38 passengers and 7 crew on board. ABC's Dan Harris rushed to the scene of that accident, and I hope is with us now. Dan, do you hear me?
Peter, I do hear you. And we have a new piece of information on this crash from ABC's Lisa Stark, who, as you know, covers aviation for ABC News. She tells us that Flight 93, which, as you mentioned, was departing from Newark and headed to San Francisco, filed for a change of flight plan request, requesting to change its destination from San Francisco to Washington. Shortly after that, it turned around and crashed about a mile from where we are right now in Stoystown, Pennsylvania. It crashed, and I believe we have some pictures of the crash scene. Crashed in an open field. All that you really see there is a huge crater. You can't even see it very well from our vantage point. A huge black gaping hole, as investigators are describing it. There is a lot of debris, most of it very small pieces of black charred remains. The FBI tonight is making a huge grid, and tomorrow morning it will begin what it calls a painstaking process of gathering the evidence. At this point, they say they're treating this as a crime, though they won't go so far as to say it is indeed an act of terrorism. If indeed the plane had successfully turned around and headed back toward Washington, and now it appears there would have been one more target. It did not make it, which is fortunate for Washington, unfortunate for the 45 people on board. No survivors, Peter.
Dan, it was indeed a chilling moment when you made a reference there to United Flight 93 asking for a change of flight plan, headed for San Francisco, asking for a flight plan that takes it to Washington. Have you picked up anything else on the ground tonight?
We have picked up from the FBI that there was 911 contact from the plane. Now, they wouldn't go so far as to confirm a report that has been circulating. The report says that one of the passengers locked himself in the bathroom of that plane and called 911 at 9:58 a.m., got in touch with a local 911 operator in this part of Pennsylvania, southwestern Pennsylvania, and told him there had been some sort of explosion on the plane. Shortly after that, 2 minutes later, in fact, the plane did go down. That report is not confirmed in total. In some, however, the FBI says it has received tapes of a 911 call, and it is going to go over those tapes.
Just help us place Stoystown, Pennsylvania, a little more, with a little greater familiarity to people. You're fairly close to Johnstown?
We are fairly close to Johnstown. Stoystown is about 75 miles southeast of Pittsburgh and about 30 miles north of Maryland. It's a very rural area, and the area where the crash happened is really very, very rural. It's an open field, and as I said, there is a huge crater. There were some eyewitnesses, coal workers, who ran to the scene shortly after the crash. We've heard that they saw the plane going down. It was very unstable before it went down, as you might imagine. People who live nearby say they heard the ground, they felt the ground shake miles away. People who went to the scene, we spoke to one eyewitness a short time ago, said she saw lots of debris, but nothing very big. And in fact, that's what our pictures are bearing out, that the debris is very, very small. This made a very hard landing, Peter.
Thanks very much, Dan Harris in Stoystown, Pennsylvania tonight on the United Airlines flight, which started off from Newark to San Francisco, took off about 8:01. You see where it all converges? The first attack on the trade tower is just before 9 o'clock. The second one is after that. Then an aircraft goes down at, sometime 8:35, between 8:30, maybe a little after 9 o'clock. And so the coordination involved in this has intelligence and military officials tonight confused, shocked, and steamed. Barbara Starr, one of our reporters at the Pentagon, reports tonight, quoting a senior intelligence official, our top priority tonight is nailing the SOBs who did this, and they are, Barbara reports us, tweaking every single intelligence system they have, their reconnaissance, their assets. And then they're going to go through, as we've heard earlier today, through all of the cable traffic. They're going to look to listen to all of the monitoring which the National Security Agency does of thousands of phone calls. And again, though this may not lead to anything, just a short while ago, Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah, who's a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, told the Associated Press that U.S. intelligence intercepted communications between supporters of Osama bin Laden discussing the attacks on the World Trade Center. And he then goes on to say, I'm just going to get his quote accurately here, they have an intercept of some information that included people associated with bin Laden who acknowledged a couple of targets were hit. I'm not sure how much that tells us at this point. They may simply having been reacting, if this report is true, they may simply have been reacting, as many people all over the world did immediately, to the fact that these attacks had actually occurred. It's not going to be very long from now before the president. I'm missing anything, John, before I go back to Washington and talk politics?
No, we're up to date.
Okay. John McCarthy, outside the Pentagon, unusually removed from your post, which I know must be very frustrating at this point, John. Want to add to Barbara Starr's reporting in terms of attitude on behalf of the military at the moment?
Well, attitude and what you described as the intelligence community is now doing is a major wash. They are going after every agent they have all over the globe. They are focusing every piece of technology they have. They are desperately looking for answers to who did it, so they can then better go after who did it with what undoubtedly, I now believe, is going to be a series of military strikes. But you cannot do that until you have a very focused piece of intelligence that leads you directly to the culprits. And then there is, of course, the problem, once you decide you are going to use military force, of trying to decide how to make it in any way effective. It does feel good oftentimes to retaliate against accused people that you believe have done a terrible act like this to the United States, but it doesn't necessarily go after them and often creates additional problems, especially if it is proved that the terrorists who did this came from a region near the Middle East, like Afghanistan. That is going to set off a whole series of very complex political machinations, Peter, that could end up coming back on the United States.
But let me ask you an operational question, John. We believe at the moment that the United States had no inkling of what was going to happen, but there's a history of terrorism in various other parts of the world to which the United States has been party, victimized by in one way or the other. After an incident has occurred, is there any history of a tendency of people who perpetrated the terrorism to talk?
There is a history to claim credit in some way. Although I must say, Osama bin Laden, if he turns out to be the culprit who is behind this, has been often circumspect in the days and months after an attack. Intelligence sources have indicated in previous attacks that his organization was involved, but they had to piece that information together because he was, at least in the initial period after the attack, absolutely silent.
Thank you very much, John McCarthy. We have a microphone open somewhere else, and I think just trying to pick up the sound that it is in our Washington position across from the White House. It's appropriate because we want to go there now where Claire Shipman has been for most of the day. And Claire, the President, I think, is going, you tell us clearly, the President's going to talk to us, I think, fairly quickly now, pretty soon now?
That's right. He's going to talk to us, we're told, in just over 10 minutes, Peter. And I think what you've been talking about tonight, a lot
Claire,
of
let me
anger.
stop. Can I stop you? Maybe you'd move your microphone up. I'm sorry. There's a microphone, I believe, in your little location there, which is interfering with what you are trying to say. So do you want to try again?
All right. Is this any better?
It's somewhat better, yeah.
Good. Okay. Rough conditions here. But you've been talking about a lot of the anger being expressed in Washington tonight from military officials and others, and I think that is the sort of thing we're going to hear from the President tonight. We've been told he is quite angry. He's eager to talk about it. We're told his speech is going to be a mix of condolence, anger, and also retaliation, that he wants to make it very plain just how quickly he intends to act when he feels the United States is able to act. He and his aides still putting finishing touches on this speech. Probably hard to exaggerate the enormous importance of this speech for him tonight, Peter. A couple of other notes. Condoleezza Rice is at the White House with him as National Security Advisor. Colin Powell arrived recently back in Washington at Andrews Air Force Base, and we're told might be heading to the White House, but that depends on some security issues. The President was to meet with Vice President Cheney once he arrived back at the White House, and then we were told from security forces that he was going to have to leave the White House. They didn't want to keep the President and the Vice President for very long in the same location, and he would either be heading home or to Camp David. Peter.
Thanks very much, Claire. We're going to come back to you very shortly because the President is going to talk. And in fact, Colin Powell just came back from Colombia today, where he has been, he's been visiting with leaders of Latin America about, among other things, the war against the international drug community, which is based very largely in Colombia. And there is no reason that any part of the world tonight should be, whatever our instincts are, whatever the history is, there's no reason tonight to rule out criminals from any part of the world who have the money, if not always the sophistication. That's a big, big question in terms of trying to resolve today, to have mounted this attack against the United States, though, as always, the intelligence community has gone almost immediately to Osama bin Laden as a principal suspect. And we don't yet know why they have done that, but it seems to be something of a tradition. It was great to see. It was really great to see the members of Congress gather and sing God Bless America, and to tell the country and the world that the country's hanging together. But there was a time earlier today when the capital city was just closing down as absolutely fast as they could get it closed down. Take a look at this report from ABC's Michelle Norris.
With the Pentagon burning in the distance, the nation's capital was evacuated.
This is the first time we had a mandatory evacuation of the Capitol and the House and Senate office buildings.
Bewildered employees got out as fast as they could, while key congressional leaders were carefully whisked away to safe and undisclosed locations. Top leaders from throughout the administration were immediately placed under special protection.
The leaders are in undisclosed locations for their own safety and to ensure that we can reconstitute decision-making when that's appropriate.
The United States Secret Service immediately secured the President, the Vice President, and the Speaker of the House, and they are all safe.
It's all part of official Washington civil defense plan to ensure that the federal government continues to function smoothly even while the nation is under attack.
And they basically have a playbook initially to assess how serious is this threat. Do we need to have a lot of people move very far away from Washington, or do we just need to have a few key backup people get outside of the immediate downtown area?
During the Cold War, the federal government developed an elaborate evacuation plan to make sure top leaders would survive a nuclear attack by taking them to a series of secret bunkers just outside Washington. Today, that wasn't necessary, but nonetheless, the nation's top decision makers remain under very heavy protection.
Making sure that the federal government continues to function, I think, is very important in a time of crisis because it reassures the public that somebody is in charge and the situation is well in hand.
And in today's time of crisis, Americans, as well as many elsewhere in the world, will be looking for that reassurance. Michelle Norris, ABC News, Washington.
Information is pouring into our newsroom from everywhere, trying to understand this. Here's a message from a friend who happens to be an architectural engineer who knows something about the World Trade Center and who believes that a member of the family may have been killed in the Trade Center at all. It's been impossible for, we've only had one person at least on this broadcast, identified all day, and that is the wife of the Solicitor General of the United States, who managed to call her husband from the aircraft that was hijacked and then subsequently attacked the Pentagon. But he, an engineer and an architect, speculates here that the heat above the crash site on the Twin Trade Towers may have indeed caused the building above to melt, just simply collapsing in itself and putting enormous weight on the rest of the building below, which could not possibly stand it. And the steel columns which go up through the building, built to code at best, would only be able, he believes, to have been able to stand an hour and a half of intense fire like this, pressing down on the rest of the building until it finally was able to give way. It was a very well-built building, probably better, given its size and the attention and everything else, much better than similar buildings built today, because it was the first of its style. And as we know, in many American cities as well as overseas, there are a lot more daring architectural structures of this magnitude in many parts of the world today. And in Asia particularly, people building these astonishingly high buildings as showplaces, almost a competition going on in the rest of the world as to who can build the tallest, most daring building. Well, there's a very simple, long box structure built well, according to the engineers who know it. And the heat of that fire from those penetrations of the two aircraft, in his view, may have made the difference. It will take us time to find out. John Miller, latest.
There's really no change other than rescue operations have started now at the World Trade Center, ones that were hampered because of the impending collapse of 7 World Trade Center, the third building to go down. Bodies have started to be brought to the morgue, but only in very small numbers now. That's going to be a massive operation that continues. And of course, as we've all discussed, the mounting of a massive federal investigation in tandem with the intelligence community's assistance to the military to try to put a name to this.
I wonder if anybody else is as aware as I am at the moment. I'm sure people are aware as I am at the moment of previous investigations we have done of far lesser incidents. Attack on TWA 800 is one. The investigation at the Al Khobar Towers, which was conducted by retired General Wayne Downing, who's with us in our Washington Bureau. We'll talk to him after the president tonight. All of these investigations have gone on and on and on and on, and many of them just really didn't resolve anything in the final analysis.
Yet many of them did. The largest acts of terrorism on U.S. soil, ironically the bombing of the World Trade Center, the attacks in East Africa have been solved to the extent that people have been charged. Many have been brought back to this country. The FBI actually has a terrific track record that way in chasing these leads out to the ends of the earth. We were talking about something a minute ago, though, that is part of the fog of war in these things. After the Al Khobar explosion, there were intercepts of people calling Osama bin Laden's headquarters to congratulate him. And in these intercepts, there was no, he didn't say, well, thanks, but it wasn't me. Now the government is taking the position that it was the Iranians. So you really have to sort through the information very carefully before you choose your suspects.
Yeah, I just simply wish to make the point that it's going to take a long time, and that the impatience that we all feel about striking back at somebody who's done this thing to the country is not going to be requited, I think, for very long. ABC's Pierre Thomas, by the way, reports that his FBI sources are telling him that several people on board both 2 of the planes which went down, this would be the one at the Pentagon, at least one of those coming either to New York or to Pennsylvania, were able to get out on their cell phones and call their relatives. And they described horrific scenes on board the aircraft, people being attacked and stabbed on board the aircraft itself. We've heard at least one piece of information that the weapon of choice, at least on one of the aircraft, was a box cutter, what professionals and sometimes amateur use with the razor blade through it that enables you to open up cardboard boxes in a hurry, and has, of course, been a weapon of crime with which we're all familiar. And as John Miller, who knows more about these things than most, pointed out easier, you take a plastic one on board and it's very hard for a security device to detect. But I want to go quickly to Midtown New York City again, just before we go to the president, and get a quick update from Diane Sawyer. Diane?
Peter, I'm standing out here, and as you can see around me, there's a dramatic change in activity, and I don't know how much you could hear earlier when we were telling you about it, but we have 6 bulldozers down here now. We have an entire line, an entire street full of EMS crews and ambulances. It appears they have got the lights up. The generators are working, and it's very possible they could be moving in soon for some kind of activity actually on the site. And I've got Don Daler here with me. We've been dividing up all the duties here, and he's been down to the scene. And also J.D. Halpern, who said he's just a volunteer who came in from California and was around the area. I just wanted to know, how much fire is there? You said you were just at ground zero. How much fire is left?
Well, the building 7, there was no fire there whatsoever, but there was one truck putting water on the building, but it's collapsed completely. And then the other building that there were some flames still coming up was in World Trade Center 1, but not a lot.
And you said you saw melted tour buses, melted cars?
The cars that were right down there, it was just unbelievable. They were twisted and melted into nothing. The debris is just unbelievable. And then you can see fire trucks and police vehicles that were down there early that all their windows, the windshields are completely blown out must have been from when debris dropped.
We can even see from here that the smoke seems to have gone down, Don. And I want to repeat, Peter, because J.D. was saying, as well as Don earlier, in case you didn't hear us, that it is carpeted up there. It is ankle deep in papers.
In some places, papers and debris go up 2 or 3 feet high. You have to wade through in some areas.
These are financial documents.
Yeah, the ones I looked at, many of them were financial documents, very personal documents that when I saw the first explosion that hit, there was just a snow cascade of paper, and the whole area down there is just coated with it.
Well, Peter, again, we'll let you know as soon as we can confirm that they are going in to the site. We should say that the mayor was here just a minute ago and drove by, waved at us, but would not stop. Back to you.
Diane, just exactly where are you?
We're about 4.5 blocks from ground zero.
Okay, thank you very much, Diane Sawyer. Don Daler. Don Daler did a wonderful job for us earlier today, giving us some sense of what was happening as close as you could get to the scene. And I'm also joined now by ABC's George Stephanopoulos, who's been downtown all today. And so we'll have a chance to revisit that scene from a variety of locations after we hear from the president, because it's 8:30 Eastern Time, 3:30 in the West, and we are about to hear from the President of the United States. I think most of you know that the president has been on something of a strange journey today. He went off to Florida to promote education. He was in Florida when this occurred. He was then literally taken up by the security apparatus which surrounds him, and taken off first to Louisiana, where he touched down at an Air Force base. We didn't know what was going to happen next. He was then taken off to Nebraska, to the old Strategic Air Command, one of the old Strategic Air Command bases from the Cold War days, put into a bunker or down the rabbit hole, as it was described to us. ABC's Ann Compton was with him all day and talked all day about the struggle between the security and the political apparatus to whether the president could get back to Washington. Well, the president is back in Washington now, and there has been no time in his presidency, and there may never be a time like this again, when it has been so important what he says to the country, because I think we all know at moments like this, the country looks to the President of the United States for understanding, for knitting the country together, and some presidents do it brilliantly, and some do not. Here is Mr. Bush. Okay, this was well, the president isn't sitting there trying to think about what to say, I can assure you. The president is sitting there because someone on network television has sat him down and said, we'll cue you in 30 seconds, Mr. Bush. And so, as awkward as it looks to him, this is what we've expected him to do. And now here he is.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight, I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
The President of the United States, when he is in many respects needed most. And we've been joined, we've been joined by George Stephanopoulos, who's been downtown all day and who very quickly picked up, George, that the President may have given us a hint in his first couple of lines there to the magnitude of this.
He said thousands of lives that were suddenly ended. The first number we've had all day by an official verifying the magnitude of the casualties. Thousands of lives suddenly ended. He also did a lot of other things in this very short speech, Peter. He gave voice to the anger that many Americans are feeling. He talked about the quiet, unyielding anger of America, and then was very pointed in giving reassurance. Military is prepared. The emergency teams are on their way. Government will be back to business tomorrow. Our economy will be back to business tomorrow. And then finally, Peter, what I found most interesting in the section about where he talked about retaliation, he said America would make no distinction between the terrorists and those who harbor them, which is a message to any state which may be supporting these terrorists who are behind this act.
Well, which creates a huge dilemma for the United States of America, because if it is discovered, as we've talked several times throughout the day, that a state, and I've forgotten who it was, a former director of the CIA perhaps earlier today, who said he couldn't believe that a state would actually support Jim Woolsey, former director of the CIA, who said directly he couldn't believe that a state would actively support an act such as this, though it may have over periods of time, as Iran and Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan have all been suspected to do, give collateral or
And that's
indirect support down through the years.
The word that the president used was so expansive, Peter. It wasn't just supported or funded. It was any who harbored them, who may have given them sanctuary at any time. That is a very open-ended commitment.
And then I thought, by the way, also, if I may add, that this president particularly, who feels so strongly about his Christianity, felt it a good time to say, to quote those lines from Psalm 23, even though I walk, or yea, though I walk through the valley of death, I fear no evil, because God is with me. And that will just sit so appropriately, I believe, in the minds and the sentiments of many Americans tonight. And we've felt throughout the day, we heard scattered reports of people going to churches and saying a prayer for those people who may or may not be lost, and for the families of those people around the country. Because don't forget, relatives in these locations have relatives all over the country. This is a total engagement with the nation. And I think you pretty much covered it all, except for one thing, George. The president talked also about the sense of safety and security of young people in America, particularly who were threatened today. And we heard that from people around the country today, people who simply could not believe, as it was the case at Oklahoma City, that this was happening in the United States. It's always something that happens somewhere else.
Or in the movies. And this is far worse than any plot that anyone could have ever devised. And I think I was downtown, as you mentioned today, Peter, so it was more surreal there, almost because people were so determined to get back to the normal life, even as all of downtown was being closed off. So I was a little bit cut off from what was happening around the country, but you did feel it down there.
But I think this is very characteristic of New York, and probably would have been characteristic of any other major community in the country, any other community as well. Terry Moran, who covers Mr. Bush for us today, but ironically wasn't with him today as he went on this education trip, not on normal. I think you are now, Terry, back at your regular location on the north lawn of the White House. Does that mean the White House has loosened up just a little bit?
Well, it has, Peter. The White House has leapt to life after several hours of the White House compound itself and the blocks around it in Washington essentially being deserted, a ghost town really coming in here. It is now a beehive of activity with government officials, cabinet secretaries. The president, of course, has returned. The First Lady has returned, and they are now working well into the night on this crisis. The president that you saw in these remarks, we are told, is the man who absorbed this tragedy today. He was described as steely throughout the day, as someone who did not react with great emotion or anger, who was able to see the pictures that America saw while he was in the air in Air Force One, and reacted very seriously, very soberly, pretty much as we saw him tonight.
Now, you say that the White House is up and running again, full in action, though the White House is clearly never completely out of action, no matter where it is. But what do you actually mean by that? What are they doing?
Well, what we are seeing right now is the president and his top advisors huddled in the Oval Office and in the study off the Oval Office. We saw cabinet secretaries and FEMA Director Joe Albaugh were here earlier, and Joe Albaugh is still here. He is briefing the president on the emergency response teams that he's sent out. The president is receiving information from his national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice. You just see a great deal of activity. And you're right, this was not a completely deserted White House. Vice President Cheney was here, as was Dr. Rice, through the day. And in fact, we are told that the president, while he was in the air, had an open line of communication to the vice president throughout the day.
And Terry, you know as well as I do that much of the country had this feeling of helplessness today. As the president said, our sense of safety and security as a national entity were attacked today. They must have been just as frustrated because they didn't really know any more in the White House than we did on the outside.
They did not, and the president's response and the Secret Service's response to the events as they developed was determined by misinformation sometime. At one point, there was a report of a car bomb going off at the State Department. At another point, there was a report that this plane that crashed in Pennsylvania was on its way towards Camp David, and those things helped determine the Secret Service's decision to keep the president out of Washington, to put in place this plan to take him to Air Force bases which are predetermined and keep him away from harm.
So the staff works on at the White House to get some sense of what is it. Thanks, Terry. I'll come back to you in just a minute, man. We've been joined in Washington by Leon Panetta, a former White House chief of staff for Bill Clinton, now out of government, back for the most part in California, if I remember correctly, Mr. Panetta.
That's correct.
What's the White House chief of staff do at a moment like this? Where do you reach? What buttons do you try to push? Who do you try to connect with? Are you in some respects at the mercy of the military and intelligence establishment at the moment?
Well, you should not be. What you should do is try to organize the White House team so that the main focus is in the White House. You have your security people, your military people, your defense people. You have your national security advisor, your State Department people. I think it's better to run this kind of crisis directly from the White House so the president is in charge of not only what happened, but what to do.
Take us back to Oklahoma City and to the attack on the barracks resident at Al-Khobar in Saudi Arabia. What am I, 96, 97? I apologize, I've forgotten.
I believe about 96.
Were you just immensely frustrated that you just didn't know anything?
Well, Oklahoma City, the first time we heard of Oklahoma City, it was on television. And we were sitting near the Oval Office watching television reports of what had happened. And it was only after it was first reported on television that we began to get some telephonic communication about what had taken place. But you feel rather helpless because you know a tragedy has taken place, but you don't know all of the facts and why it happened. And you know, Oklahoma is a good example of not jumping to conclusions, because in Oklahoma City, we had all kinds of thoughts that this was a Middle East terrorist effort in Oklahoma, and it turned out not to be. So I hope this country has the patience to carefully investigate, determine who really did this, and then respond.
To be open about it, we've said this several times today and reminded people in Oklahoma City that our tendency towards prejudice emerged pretty quickly and was proved to be wrong. As you have tried, I assume, to talk to people around the world today, have you picked up anything which contributes to the understanding of this?
Not really. I mean, you know, you have obviously your suspicions about who's involved, but we are a country that believes first and foremost in justice. That's what distinguishes us from the people who carried out these acts. So I hope we take the time to fully investigate this matter, determine who did it, and then take appropriate action. That's what a great democracy does.
But there is, Mr. Panetta, tremendous pressure on the president to strike back at somebody. We've struck back at Osama bin Laden's training camps in Afghanistan, didn't get him, spent a fortune, and didn't accomplish very much. Is the pressure on the president huge to do something in order to satisfy the anger and the frustration of the American people?
The pressure is incredible, Peter. It's coming from politicians on Capitol Hill. It's coming from constituents. It's coming from, I'm sure, many in the public who want to strike back in some way. The president is the leader of this country. He's got to take the time to make sure we do what's right. And what's right in this instance is to take the time to fully investigate this matter, determine who are the culprits, and then take appropriate action. That's been the course of action that the United States has taken in the past, and it's the course of action we've got to take now.
Thanks very much, Leon Panetta, for joining us, reminding us that the president's resolve will be tested, but also so will be his patience. We've talked a lot about the attack on Al-Khobar in Saudi Arabia in the mid-1990s, when American military personnel posted in Saudi Arabia were the victims of a terrorist attack. And the retired General Wayne Downing is with us in the Washington Bureau. He was the senior military officer assigned to write the report on the Al-Khobar towers. And General Downing, you there?
Yes, I am.
Yes, you are. There's one note, in the note that was handed to me a while ago about you. You were responsible for making recommendations about making U.S. citizens safe from worldwide terrorist attacks. What were your recommendations, and is there anything that happened today which suggested your recommendations were not followed?
No, I think in this particular case, Khobar Towers was a surprise. It should not have been, because we had a bombing over there in Saudi Arabia in November of 1995. And Khobar, after that bombing, was assessed to be the #1 target in the Middle East. And in the subsequent bombing in June, we found ourselves surprised, a lack of situational awareness. I don't think that's the case today. I think people in our Congress people in the executive branch, certainly the National Commission on Terrorism that I served on last year, it was a congressionally appointed commission, pointed out that we had a serious problem with the possibility of an attack by weapons of mass destruction. And if we saw anything today, we saw an attack with weapons of mass destruction.
General Downing, I've asked this question several times today. Perhaps you wouldn't mind answering it as well. There is a sense that the intelligence community or the counter-terrorist organizations in the country were consumed with the fear or the awareness of a chemical or biological weapons attack on the United States, and this kind of conventional attack got less than full appreciation, the potential of it. Is that a fair observation?
I don't think that's fair. I think certainly we have been concerned about chemical and biological, but I think the experts in this business have always felt that our greatest threat came from a kinetic energy weapon or an event like this, a suicide, if not aircraft, certainly a suicide bomber, suicide truck.
And do you agree with others today, particularly in the intelligence community, both in it currently and even some members of Congress who said the failure here is the United States' emphasis on human intelligence around the world, that one of the mistakes the United States made was to downgrade the degree of human intelligence that people thought was necessary?
Well, this is a complicated subject. Certainly when the American barracks in Beirut was bombed in 1983, one of the findings that Admiral Long came up with on his investigation was we had a problem with intelligence. Certainly one of the things that came out of Khobar was we didn't have enough human intelligence. We did not have tactical warning. But I think what we came up with was the fact that the terrorists we're up again are not going to give us the opportunity to get tactical warning. And so it's a very, very difficult subject. Now, to be fair to the intelligence community, they have made Herculean efforts over the last several years to improve our access to tactical information. And it's a very, very difficult subject. It's a difficult subject because we as Americans are very uneasy sometimes with the type of people we have to deal with to get this kind of intelligence. So on the one hand, we want the information, but on the other hand, we get very upset sometimes with some of the dirty, rotten people you must deal with who have this kind of information. And I think we're in a new era now. I mean, I think we've seen a formal declaration of war on the United States, although it shouldn't surprise us. We've had a lot of people saying this, our enemies, people who hate us, for many years. But now we see a manifestation on a scale that is almost unbelievable.
Downing, I very much appreciate you waiting for us and taking the time to tell us, to talk to us. Is the former Commander-in-Chief of the Special Operations Unit, is General Downing, and he wrote the Khobar's report, the report which investigated the attack on Americans in Saudi Arabia in November of 1995. We're going to go in just a second now to ABC's Robert Krulwich and then talk to the engineer, or one of the engineers who worked on the trade tower, see if we can understand what it was that brought these buildings down today. But first, some more fairly late news from John Miller. John?
Since the rescue workers are now first starting to work that scene, they're starting to have some very interesting results. 2 Port Authority police officers, the Port Authority being the entity that runs the World Trade Center, have been found trapped in the rubble. There is a team of police officers trying to dig them out. They're apparently alive. A strange case, a 911 operator in Pennsylvania says she's received a call from people trapped in the rubble 40 feet from the Vista Hotel or the Millennium Hotel. They say they're near a fountain.
On the west side of Manhattan.
Yes, right. In the World Trade Center complex. And they're calling out from where they're trapped beneath the rubble to a 911, perhaps on a Pennsylvania cell phone, but that went to an operator in Pennsylvania, and they're trying to kind of triangulate where they are to get to them. So things are picking up there. They're also They've also brought in dogs from all the counties around the city to aid in helping to sniff victims out.
Exactly, as we've said before today, exactly they do in the case of an earthquake. People are now underground, and dogs are just the best thing you have in trying to locate them.
Yet, as we've learned so often in modern times, in recent times, in Columbine, the role of the cell phone in modern disaster is incredible. From the people who called out from the airplane, something we really didn't expect, an odd development, to people perhaps calling out from the rubble, if that's a legitimate call to the Pennsylvania operator.
Great. John Miller, we'll come back to you. Now to try to examine the building. ABC's Robert Krulwich has put together a piece on the structural engineering of the World Trade Centers, perhaps better able help us to understand that when these two aircraft hit these two towers today, exactly what was going on. Robert?
Why did the towers collapse as quickly and as suddenly as they did? Engineers from the original firm that built the towers told ABC they can only guess at this point, but they believe that the collisions themselves, the plane hitting building number 1 and the plane that smashed into building number 2, by themselves, they did not cause the collapse. It was the fire, they say, the intense fire and heat from the explosions that brought the buildings down. Temperatures inside could have built up to 1600 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, steel loses its strength and steel beams connect every floor to the outside walls. As it got hotter, the beams got weaker, and the hot air inside began to push and press against the outside walls until the outside walls just buckled, snapped, and released the top floor, which fell onto the floor below, and the entire building sinks in a straight vertical, the floors falling faster and faster down, until you notice that every floor in the building is gone. Viewed from another angle, you can see the same thing. Notice the aerial stays vertical, just stays straight as it sinks into the building. There's no buckling or tipping, just straight down. And this happened in both buildings. The first tower, too, stayed straight as it went down, each floor falling neatly on top of the other. So the reason the towers went so quickly is because all the floors were literally hanging onto the skin. And once the skin went, the buildings went too. Robert Krulwich, ABC News.
Well, that report, as we look at New York City at night, which has a still quality about it tonight. It's a city of light at night, as so many American cities are, but there's a still, almost calm look of it from the sky. It's anything but that on the ground. But this is the second time from Robert Krulwich and also from some architect engineers we talked to a little earlier that say it was the heat which caused the building to collapse, because that the steel at the top of the building would maybe have only been able to sustain an hour and a half of intense fire, and then the steel begins, as Robert points out, so clearly collapse upon itself all the way down to the bottom. I think we have with us on the phone or in person from Seattle, John Magnuson, who is an engineer. John, are you there? John Magnuson, who is with the company that actually built the World Trade Center towers. John, have you heard our two layman explanations tonight of what it was we think collapsed the building, and do you agree or disagree?
I agree. I need to say one thing. At the time of the design of the World Trade Center, that was in the mid-1960s, and I was in 6th grade. So to kind of put in perspective how much time has passed since this design was actually completed. But the description of the fact that steel, when it gets up to 1500, 1600 degrees Fahrenheit, that it loses its strength is accurate. The buildings actually survived the impact of both the planes, and it was really the fire that finally created the disaster.
And the upper floor fell on the next floor down, which fell on the next floor, and the sheer accumulation of weight just forced the whole building to collapse on itself.
Right there, from the videotape, and I can only go from what I've seen on television, but the videotape showed that several of the upper floors fell onto the next lower floor that was still intact. And once that happens, there's going to be an instant overload situation, and then it will fail. And then that will drop down to the next floor into another instant overload situation. And so the floors just progressively collapse down all the way to the bottom.
I appreciate very much the fact that you were very young in the mid-1960s when the trade towers were built, though I have heard it said earlier today that they in fact, were stronger, more sensible structures than many of the more daring-shaped buildings that are being built in parts of the world today.
Right. The term that structural engineers use is redundancy. And the World Trade Center towers really set a new standard in redundancy. And that's why those airplanes were able to crash into the towers without causing the structural failure. The buildings were still standing. And then the problem was the fire and the jet fuel. And in normal buildings, all the steel is protected with fireproofing, and there's sprinkler systems, but they're not designed to protect against a jet fuel fire inside of a building.
Can you be a little more precise what you mean by redundancy?
Redundancy is that if you have a structural element that is damaged and is no longer able to carry the load, that load is able to be passed on to other elements or other columns or other beams within the building. And the columns on the World Trade Center, they were spaced at 39 inches on center all the way across each face.
What does that mean, 39 inches at center?
Every 3 feet 3 inches there was a column that supported the building. So they were very closely spaced together. Many buildings, the columns are 10 or 15 feet apart or more. And so having these very close spaced columns on the outside created a lot of redundancy. That's why there was able to be a hole in the side. If you go back and look at the tapes, there was a tremendous hole in the side of the building, and it didn't collapse until the fire brought it down.
And Trade Tower number 7, which was the last to go, which was a building 47 stories high, do you have any sense of why it ultimately collapsed? Was it the concussion of the other buildings collapsing which undermined it?
I'm not familiar with that building. We were not involved in that building, and I haven't seen any of the details on that yet.
So aside from your horror, which I assume you share with the rest of us today, when you look at what has happened today, do you learn something?
Well, it's a very difficult situation because if you take that much of a load and that much jet fuel and you put it into a building, there's very little that you can do. And really, I think the solution to this will be to keep the planes and keep these attacks away from the doorsteps of these buildings.
John Nance, who's our aviation analyst, said to us several hours ago when speculating, as we all are in many cases, about who may have been involved, said he would not be surprised if somewhere in the world there was a structural engineer who was part of this operation. Does that make sense to you?
It makes sense. I sure would hope not. Every structural engineer is dedicated to preserving public safety, and just the thought that someone would take that training and use it for evil purposes just really disgusts me.
Is there anything I've missed, John?
No.
No? Okay. I'm very grateful for the time. What's it like up there in Seattle tonight? People feeling exactly the same thing people here in New York City are feeling?
Yes, and there was certainly a lot of apprehension during the day. Many of the buildings were evacuated just as precautionary measures. But there's this same empty feeling in your stomach about the whole thing, and just watching. People, of course, were glued to the coverage on the television sets.
Well, thank you for being so articulate about it and helping us understand, at least thank you very much, from the cold-blooded language of engineers and journalists covering this from some distance today, the structure of the building, which may not have been able to stand up to that fire, which was caused when those two planes, the first and the second, struck under somebody's control fairly high up in these superstructures, and then simply, as Robert Krulwich pointed out, and John Magnuson confirms, collapsed down upon themselves. And it was the president, we think. George Stephanopoulos is still with me. You were down there all today. It was the president, we think, who gave some clue to that which we have feared most of the day, that it wasn't hundreds of people involved in this, but thousands.
But thousands, yes. But Peter, I think, and I was thinking of this as John Magnuson was talking, when you talk about the strength of the building, in the coming days, we're also going to be hearing about some amazing, not only rescue stories, but survival stories. I spoke with the relative of someone who was on the 102nd floor of the first building today. After it took the hit from the airplane, that person still made it down from the 102nd floor and is home safe.
It's very interesting because one of the lawyers had come down from a lower floor, believed that many people had got down in a fairly orderly fashion from some of the highest floors, at certainly right underneath where the attack had occurred, which has given people here, and I suspect in the country, some hope tonight that many more people get out of this building than we thought. It is now 9 o'clock Eastern Time. In the East, it is now 6 o'clock. On the West Coast, up and down the West Coast in the United States, it is about 12 hours just 12 hours and a bit since many of us walking to work were suddenly confronted with having to deal with this in one way or another. And there's a huge, huge number of developments to catch up with. I want to go first of all, as we just review this, because this all happened in the morning of Good Morning, right in the middle of at the very end of Good Morning America. Charles Gibson, Charlie Gibson, and Diane Sawyer were there on television live when this happened, and so it seems appropriate that we go to Diane, and Diane, ask you to put together some reconstruction of it for us.
Traffic helicopters were the first to report an explosion in the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Witnesses say they saw it, a plane crashing into the building.
I saw something push the building in, and then I saw the tail, and then I saw flame.
Everybody on, let's go! Evacuation begins inside the building. Then, a few minutes later, just after 9 a.m., as smoke pours from the top of the North Tower, an unbelievable sight, a second plane hitting the South Tower.
Oh my God! Oh, my God!
There are gaping holes in flames coming now from both towers. Witnesses see people screaming from the higher floors.
They're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
I see people jumping from the top of the World Trade Center.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the fire.
It was about 10 o'clock a.m. when the South Tower collapsed.
A huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way.
On the ground, there's chaos. Flaming debris, someone said, like at the dark side of the moon.
It was bad. It was like a dust storm or something. Like I couldn't see anything.
About 20 minutes later, the second tower crumbles to the ground.
Oh my God, there it goes!
Symbols of New York, the World Trade Center towers, are simply gone.
Diane Sawyer giving us what it was like, at least from a distance, because we've all been at a distance from this, what it was like in those first moments. Now let's look at it from another perspective, because ABC's Lisa Stark, who covers aviation for us, as we've said several times today, is able, I think, to take you there, Lisa?
I am, Peter.
Lisa's in Seattle today, where she's been out at the Boeing company. It was Boeing jets, Boeing equipment, 757s and 767s involved. Why don't you just walk us through what you and we now know about how this unfolded from the point of view of the hijackers?
All right, I will, but Peter, I want to give you a little bit of new information first, if I may. There's a meeting going on, we understand, between the Federal Aviation Administration and the major carriers at this point. They are trying to determine how they might be able to get air service back up and going again tomorrow, what steps would need to be taken. We do understand from a number of sources that one of the things they are considering is a resumption of the Air Marshal program. That would be armed air marshals that would actually fly on a number of flights. Now, that happens now in the United States, but it's a very small percentage of flights. It's unclear whether they would ramp up to every flight. That seems unlikely. But whether they are considering whether they would put air marshals on a number of flights as a precaution throughout the United States, one of the options that they are talking about.
Okay, just before you go to your chronology then, let
Yes.
me remind people that what you mean by air service back up is because hundreds of airplanes and thousands of passengers, an extraordinary job of air traffic control and pilots getting planes safely on the ground when the FAA decided everybody should land at the nearest possible airport, many of which are in Canada. And so there are thousands of people stranded far away from home tonight, safe, but when you refer to air service being got back up again, you basically mean getting the nation's air communication systems back up and running.
Absolutely. There's a national ground stop throughout the United States until at least noon tomorrow. It's going to be a massive task to get the system up and running, and obviously the main concern is to do it safely, to make sure that we don't have a repeat of the horrible events that we saw today. So there are security issues that are paramount, and there are also simply operational issues. How do you sort of turn the switch back on? and get as many as 40,000 flights every day in the United States back in the air. And those discussions about that are underway right now, we understand.
We'll all follow that one. Now take us, if you would, through the movement of the aircraft which were ultimately and fatally involved.
What we know is that American Airlines Flight 11 was the first plane involved. That was the plane, a 767, en route from Boston's Logan Airport to Los Angeles. The plane took off shortly after 8 o'clock, we understand. About a half hour into the flight, it made a sharp left turn down towards New York. There were massive changes in airspeed apparently at that time. As the plane then headed toward Manhattan, it slowed and slammed into the World Trade Tower. It had been in the air about 45 minutes. Now, at the same time this was going on, there was a United Airlines 767, Flight 175, also from Boston to Los Angeles. It also was in the air, taken over by hijackers. That plane made a turn towards New Jersey, then made virtually a U-turn and came up toward the Trade Tower from the south, came over Staten Island. It slammed into the second Trade Tower. It had also been in the air about 45 minutes. Now, before any of these planes actually hit the World Trade Center, a third plane, a United Airlines 757, American Airlines American Airlines 757. It was Flight 77 from Dulles, had taken off. It was bound for Los Angeles as well. We don't know much about the flight path of that plane. We believe it was in the air about 1 hour before it hit the Pentagon. Then we have the fourth plane, United Flight 93, another 757 en route from Newark to San Francisco. We are unclear about the departure time. We have some conflicting information about that, whether it was close to 8 o'clock or closer to 8:45. It did depart Newark Airport. It appears that hijackers may have taken control of the plane over Cleveland. That is when it suddenly made a turn back toward the east. We also understand that sometime at that point, someone from the cockpit called the FAA and requested a change in flight plan. They said, we're not going to San Francisco. We want to go to Washington, D.C., to DCA, which is National Airport. It's unclear whether there was another Washington target, perhaps, that this plane was aiming for. Either way, it didn't make it all the way to Washington. It crashed in Pennsylvania. A total of 266 passengers and crew on all four of these planes. The toll could have been even much, much worse on the jetliners because they were very lightly filled. They can hold anywhere from 185 to 250 people. The most crowded plane had 90 passengers and crew members on it. Peter, we also want to mention, if we can, that as this was unfolding, people on board these planes were able to communicate what was going on. We know some details about that. We know on Flight 11, that was the American Airlines flight, the first one that hit the World Trade Tower, a flight attendant was able to call the American Airlines Operations Center. The flight attendant informed them that a number of flight attendants had been stabbed and that the perpetrators had stormed the cockpit. She was also able to tell them, apparently, the seat number of at least one of the hijackers. She was able to give them that information. We also know that there were some cell phone calls from at least two of the other planes. There was a cell phone call, as you have reported earlier, from the plane that slammed into the Pentagon, a woman calling her husband, saying that these hijackers were on board, that they had box cutters, those sorts of knives, and they had herded all of the passengers into the back of the plane. And we understand there was also a cell phone call on the United 175 flight. That was the other flight that hit the World Trade Tower. Apparently, a son on that plane called his father from his cell phone and also said there were hijackers on board with knives. So we do know that as the events were unfolding, what was going on 30,000 feet above the United States was being communicated. Of course, unfortunately, there was nothing the people on the ground could do about any of this except watch in horror as these planes ended up where they ended up.
Well, thanks very much, Lisa Stark, who has given us a very clear picture many times today on what precisely happened, or at least as much as we know of what happened. Thank you. On board those planes, we do not very often make recommendations for people's behavior from this chair, but as Lisa was talking, I checked in with my children, and who are deeply distressed, as I think young people are across the United States. And so if you're a parent, you got a kid in some other part of the country, call them up, exchange observations. People have been getting onto sites on the web, which is a very good, vigorous way for people, very good way for people to communicate. Some of the things people have been telling us at ABC News, at abcnews.com, after today, nothing changes. Sorry, everything changes. Nothing will ever be the same. The way you've lived your life, enjoyed your freedom, your very personal expression, it all changes after today. From someone else, only a month ago, I laid on a bench outside the World Trade Center and marveled at what man could create, looking up at those 110 stories, and now I stare in disbelief at what man can take away. I want retribution, said one person to abcnews.com, and that's a sentiment that has been widely, deeply expressed in the heart of the political establishment in Washington and by people in every walk of life across the country. And as George Stephanopoulos and Leon Panetta, the former White House Chief of Staff, have made very clear, and as the President clearly knows already, one of the things the President has to do is be patient and understand who it is who did this before the country can do anything by way of retaliation. Here's a slightly chilling one. If they can pull off an act like this, they are certainly capable of eventually sending nuclear weapons this way. And this is very interesting. How can people keep calling it the modern Pearl Harbor? At least we knew who we were up against back then. Of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese was a surprise to a great many Americans in the middle of afternoon ball games. This is the first time today that Major League Baseball has ever canceled all its games since D-Day, the invasion of Normandy in World War II. And one of the enormously frustrating things for the intelligence establishment, for the political establishment, for all of us in the country today, not to mention anyone else in the world who was a friend of the United States, perhaps even a foe, is to understand who it was who actually did this. And the reverberations from this are indeed global. Air traffic, we already know, listening to Lisa Stark and our own reporting earlier today, is snarled around the world, especially in Europe. The impact of what happens there in terms of transportation and commerce. The stock exchange was closed today. It all has an effect somewhere else. Any place there is a proposed mass gathering, in many parts of the world, they are rethinking it. In Germany, they have now canceled the Frankfurt Car Show, which is one of the biggest car shows, if not the biggest car show in the world. There's some consideration to canceling the Oktoberfest, the great beer and culture festival in Munich, in Germany. France has called a general security alert, and I'm just told that Ted Koppel is with us in London, live. Ted has been in London and now can go even further than that, please, Ted, on telling us what's happened in Europe and as much as you know elsewhere.
Well, I must tell you, Peter, I've spent the better part of this day trying to get from where I was, which about 12 hours ago was in Italy, to where you are. And as you well know, and as you've been reporting for much of the day, getting into the United States from overseas is a very difficult task indeed. But it's just about, what time is it here? 2:15 in the morning here in London. And some of the early editions of the newspapers have come through, and I thought you might like to take a look at them. Let me hold them up. There's not a great deal that differentiates the tabloids today from the more serious newspapers. You can see it: Apocalypse, New York, September 11th, says the Daily Mail. Declaration of war, says the Daily Express. And then this one, which perhaps goes farther than it might: is this the end of the world, from the Daily Star? And so it goes. The Mirror, war on the world. The Sun, the day that changed the world. And now one of the more serious newspapers, the Independent, and again the same horrific pictures that we have been seeing all day long. And the Independent says, Doomsday America, the times of London when war came to America. And so it has gone. And I must tell you, Peter, the only thing I can tell you is, as you know, when we're overseas, American tourists tend to turn to folks like us, expecting that we know something. I'm afraid I knew less than they did. It was some other tourists who informed me earlier in the day of what had happened, and I went rushing back to my hotel room and packed while I was watching the television scenes that you have been reporting on all day. And all I can tell you is that this was a day when, as soon as people found out you were an American, they turned to you with expressions of grief, expressions of horror, expressions of outrage, and an offer to do anything they could do to help, which in my case meant getting a little bit closer to New York or Washington. Peter?
Ted, have you managed, I totally sympathize with what you've gone through today, and as bad as a day it is for many Americans, I understand what you mean when you say it's been a good day to be reminded that people around the world admire and sympathize with America and suffer with it. Can you give us some sense, if you have any whatsoever, just from looking at the reporting there, as to how governments are responding as well as individuals?
Well, again, Peter, and you've been in this situation often enough to be sympathetic to it. I literally just landed in London. We had to charter from Paris to get over here because flying into Heathrow wasn't that easy, especially at this time of night. And have only landed now and been reading the wires in the car coming in. And I do know that Tony Blair has expressed strong condemnation and, of course, a sense of oneness with the United States. Perhaps, Peter, the